My name is Vicky, and this is Elizabeth. Last week we started lesson 3, and a few points from lesson 3 is we talked about the origin of languages, the beginning of nations after the flood, and the time of the patriarchs, God's covenant with Abraham. We talked about judgment against sin, Isaac, the promised son of Abraham, and we talked about Abraham's faith being tested. And lastly, we talked about Jacob and Esau, and how we talked about how Esau sold his birthright uh, to Jacob, and they were brothers. And Liz will continue lesson 3 from there.
So after Jacob steals the blessing from Esau, he goes to Haran to get married and to flee from Esau, and that's where we're going to start off. And Jacob is by himself at this time when he encounters God. He had his family split up, and as Jacob traveled to this place alone, it was a place called Luz, and when he prepared to stay the night, while he slept, he dreamed a dream, and where God spoke to him in that dream. And I'll read a passage that describes what happened in his dream. It says, "I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And we're reading from Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 to 14. And that's what God was saying to Jacob in his dream. "And Jacob awoke and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. Being afraid, he continued to say, How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And Jacob remembers this as the house of the Lord. Early in the morning, he rose from his sleep after having this dream, and God talking to him, giving him that promise we read about in Genesis chapter 28, verse 16. Chapter 28. And he said, and he made a vow unto God, and he said, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me," and he's talking to God, making a vow to God, he said, "Surely I will give a tenth unto thee." And at this point, that's when God renewed his vow and covenant with he renewed the covenant he made with Abraham and Isaac. He also made the same covenant to Jacob. And on his way after going to Laban's house, he had a family there, and that's where he got all his 12 sons, and he married his wives. And on the way back, after he was like married and got like all his cattle, even though Laban tried to trick him, God blessed him still, and God was telling him that he needed to go back to his father's house. And on the way back, he wrestles with an angel of the Lord. He spent 20 years at Laban's house. This encounter is after 20 years of him stealing the blessing and having a family of his own sons, his own 12 sons. He was on his way back to see his father, and he heard that Esau was coming to meet him. And the last time he saw Esau, Esau threatened to kill him after his father died. And so he was afraid. And he sent his family before him, and he was by himself when this happened, and he wrestled an angel. And we'll see what their conversation was like. And angel of the Lord touched the hollow of the Jacob's thigh while he was wrestling it, because it was the breaking of day already. And the angel said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And Jacob answered, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." And the angel asked, "What is thy name?" And Jacob answered, "I will not," and Jacob said his name. "My name is Jacob. And the angel said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob," said the angel, "but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with man, and has prevailed." And you can read that in Genesis chapter 32, verses 24 to 28. And because of his persistence, Jacob received the blessing that he desired, and he left that place a different man, and he needed an intervention from God because he couldn't face his brother alone with the threat of Esau's threat to kill him. He needed to seek God, and he got it because he persisted in prayer. And Jacob meant supplanter, and the connotation of trickery and deceit. But after his encounter with God, his new name is Israel, which meant he who strives with God. And there was even a physical difference after he had an encounter with God, because the angel touched the hollow of his thigh, and each step that he took, he probably remembered his encounter with God and what happened then. And after you have an encounter with God, you'll never be the same. Just like Jacob was never the same. Oh, we're on the wrong slot. This is the one. Need to be a chosen nation. And Israel, as we said, in those 20 years that he spent with Laban, like we talked about earlier, he had 12 sons. And the second, he had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. And Joseph was Israel's favorite son. And we're going to see what happened in Joseph's life. God reaffirmed his covenant with Jacob, and Jacob was the father of 12 sons. And Vicky's going to read Genesis chapter 35, verses 22 to 26.
And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah his father's concubine. And Israel heard it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. And the sons of Belial, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob, which were born to him in Pandanaram.
And Joseph was chosen to be a preserver of Jacob's family. And Joseph, because he was the favorite of Israel, was hated by his brothers. And so, and one of the days that he was there, Jacob asked him to go check on his brothers because they were watching after the sheep. And Joseph told his brothers the dreams, and because he was Jacob's favorite, they were already hated, but they hated him even more after he told them his dreams, because in his dreams, he had dreams that meant that all his brethren would bow down to him, and they were jealous. And so when Joseph was going to check on his brothers, they saw it as they saw him from afar off coming, and saw it as an opportunity to get rid of Joseph. And after throwing Joseph into a pit, they decided to sell Joseph as a slave. And Joseph was sensitive to God, a person of high moral character. His brothers were jealous, and they sold him to a Midianite merchants for 20 pieces of silver. And the Midianite merchants took them to Egypt, where they sold him to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officers and a captain of the guard. After having disposed of Joseph, his brothers took because his father made him a coat of many colors because he was his favorite, and that showed, like when you had a coat of many colors, that showed like favor, and that you were like loved and blessed. And his brothers, after they sold him, they took his coat and they killed a goat and dipped the coat that their father made for Joseph in blood, and in the blood of the goat that was killed. And they bring it to their father and asked, "Is this thy son's coat?" And Jacob, their father, said, "It is my son's coat." And then after he saw the coat like dripping in blood, he's like, "An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces." In his despair, Jacob refused to be comforted and mourned with tears for Joseph, because that's his favorite son. And you can read about that in Genesis 37, verses 31 to 35. Meanwhile, Joseph was being conscientious and a godly man, while his brothers are showing his father, and Jacob's thinking that he's dead, but he's actually in Potiphar's house. And we're going to read about what Joseph did and how he reacted to his circumstance. He did his very best to serve Potiphar. He could have been better, but he chose to do his best to serve him with to the best of his ability. And Potiphar noticed that Joseph was doing this and that God was with him, and everything that Joseph did prospered. And finally, Potiphar made Joseph the overseer of all that he had. And Potiphar concerned himself only with the food that was set before him to eat. And Joseph took care of everything in the house. And Joseph was very prosperous. And while he was doing this, there is temptation, and temptations will come, because the Bible says they will. Joseph's trials were not over. However, Potiphar's wife became infatuated with Joseph and tempted him daily to commit immorality with her. He steadfastly refused her advances until one day, as he fled from her presence, she grasped a part of his clothing, and seeing that she was rebuffed, she contrived to blame Joseph with trying to assault her, and she used his clothing as proof. Potiphar, when he got home, he was mad and put Joseph in prison because Potiphar believed his wife, which lied about Joseph. So Joseph was lied about, and because of the lie that Potiphar's wife told, Joseph was cast into the king's prison of Egypt. And Joseph was in prison, and Joseph kept the right attitude even though he was falsely accused and put into prison. He refused to be bitter and looked for opportunities to serve God. And he was eventually given a position where he was committed to all the hand of all the prisoners. He was responsible for all the prisoners because God was with him even when he was put in jail. And the complete man, and God blessed Joseph and was preparing him for the fulfillment of the two dreams he had before his brothers sold him into slavery. And while he was in prison, he met two of Pharaoh's servants that had dreams, and both of and they couldn't understand the dreams they had. And in the dreams, there was the interpretations that Joseph gave. The dreams came true. The dreams came true according to Joseph's interpretation because God was with him. The butler was restored to his office, and the baker was hanged. And Joseph asked the butler to remember him because he didn't want to be in the prison anymore. And he was in the prison after 2 years because the butler forgot. But what bringing Joseph back into remembrance is Pharaoh had a dream, and none of his men could interpret it. None of his wise men or wizards, they couldn't do it. And the butler remembered Joseph after 2 years of him being out of the prison, and his dream coming true according to Joseph's interpretation. He remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him, and told Pharaoh that Joseph could interpret his dream. And Pharaoh called for Joseph, who told him the significance of his dream. And the significance of Joseph's dream was this: Egypt would experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh promoted Joseph to the position of the second most powerful ruler in all of Egypt, and gave to his 30 and Joseph is 30 years old at this time. So like he had this dream when he was like, people think it was like at age 17 maybe, so like that's like, I don't know, at least 13 years before his dream is coming to pass. And so the dream that Pharaoh had is that Egypt would experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine that was that Pharaoh was warned about also affected the land of Canaan, where his brothers were staying, and his father's household, and they were affected by the famine. And when Jacob heard that there was bread in Egypt, he's like, why don't you guys go down there and buy some bread, because this famine is affecting us and we need food. And so they went to go buy some food from Egypt. And when they did, Joseph recognized his brothers, and he remembered his dream, because they went and bowed down to him, because he was the second highest in power in Egypt, and he was in charge of selling the food that he made sure was stored away in the 7 plenteous years. And Joseph hid himself from them because he recognized them. He disguised himself, and he spoke in a different language that wasn't Hebrew. He spoke the Egyptian language because he was speaking to them through an interpreter. And he disguised them and spoke roughly, and he wanted to figure out if his father was still alive, and attempting a plan to devise to bring his father to Egypt, because he hadn't seen his father in all these years. And he accused his brothers of being spies. And when they denied the charges and said that they were all the sons of one man, they were all the sons of one man, and that they had a brother at home, and one of them was not. They were talking about Joseph because they sold him. And Joseph took one of his brothers, Simeon, and bound him until the others could return with their younger brother, because he asked that they bring their younger brother so they could prove that they weren't spies, as proof. And this according to Joseph, would be proof that they were innocent and that they weren't spies. And Jacob was greatly troubled and refused to send Benjamin for fear that he, like Joseph, would never return. But when the famine grew worse, they didn't have a choice but to go and get more food from Egypt. And Joseph made it pretty plain that they weren't going to see his face again, except that Benjamin was with them, because that was the proof that they were going to be innocent. And Simeon's still in jail at this point. And this time, so the brothers are going back with Benjamin, because Judah takes personal responsibility and tells his father, I'll make sure that that nothing happens to Benjamin, and you can slay my sons if something happens to him, I'll take responsibility. That's what Judah said. It took some convincing because Jacob didn't want a repeat of what happened to Joseph. And so after they convinced Jacob that they would protect Benjamin, they all went down to Egypt, and Joseph wanted to keep Benjamin, so he secretly, when they were after they were done buying their food to bring back to Canaan, he slipped his silver cup into Benjamin's bag because he wanted, and returned the brothers' money in the sacks that they were carrying the food in. And when the brothers were stopped by Joseph's servant and returning to him, because he accused them and said, "Whoever has my cup, let him be my servant." And they searched all the bags, and they started from the oldest and then to the youngest. And at one point while this is happening, Joseph could no longer refrain from revealing to them who he was, that he was his brother, and he was weeping and said aloud, "I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?" And his brothers were troubled and surprised, and they couldn't answer Joseph, who had every reason to be bitter and harsh and unforgiving, but that's not what Joseph was. But he said, "Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life." He knew his purpose. Long before the New Testament was ever written, Joseph had learned one of the most valuable lessons that we could ever learn, and that's found in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, who are called according to his purpose. And Joseph later said, I think this is after his father dies, and they think that Joseph's gonna be angry at them, and but anyways, in Genesis 50:20 it says, "Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive." And Joseph did just that, and his family was preserved. Joseph supplied his brothers with wagons and equipment to return to Canaan, so that they could dwell in the land of Goshen, so that they could be preserved during the rest of the famine. They returned to Canaan and brought their father Jacob back to Egypt to settle in the land of Goshen. And God actually spoke to Jacob and said, "Don't be afraid to go to Egypt for the famine," in a dream. And here they enjoyed many years of blessings, peace, and plenty while Joseph was alive. And this is also where the children of Israel become a nation, because after Joseph's death, a new king arose in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And this Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph began to be fearful of the Israelites because they were growing and fast, and they were numerous and strong. And this Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph was afraid that they would side with his enemies to help overthrow Egypt in a war. And in his fear, the new Pharaoh set taskmasters over Israelites and made them slaves. But the more that the Egyptians afflicted the Israelites, the more stronger they became, and they tried to kill. They even had an order for midwives to kill baby boys, but the midwives refused, and God blessed them for fearing God. And God was preparing them for the great exodus from Egypt back into the promised land of Canaan. And that's all we have time for today. It's also the end of lesson 3. We're going to start lesson 4 next week. See you then.